Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm just going to wait another minute to make sure that we've got some more people joining and just give them a couple of minutes of comfort time to switch into the webinar. We'll just be starting in a minute. Hi everyone, thank you for joining us and taking time out of your busy schedules to attend this webinar. I am Melissa Bedinger. I am a researcher from Heriot-Watt University, and I'm going to be kicking off the webinar about our research project. Joining me is also Bensari Sharma from Mahila Housing Trust, who was another collaborator on this project. Don't know if you want to say hello, Bensari, just quickly.
Hello everyone, I'm Bansi. I work with Mahila Housing Trust and I'm urban planner by my academic qualification. Thank you.
Great. Feel free to use the chat and the Q&A functions as usual. I'm sure you're all used to Zoom meetings by now, and we'll be able to pick up questions at the end. So I'll just share my screen now, I believe. There we go. Hopefully you're all able to see my presentation. Bensari, could you just give a thumbs up? You can see it. So,
yes.
Thank you. Great. So I'm Melissa Bedinger. We're here to talk about the Climate Resilient Slums project. I should say that this webinar is being recorded so that it can be on Mahila Housing Trust YouTube channel and be circulated to people who weren't able to attend today. And also it's being streamed on Facebook Live, so just be aware of that. Just to broadly describe what we're going to go through in the next hour and a little bit, I'll explain about the origin of the research project, the problem we were trying to tackle, a new way of looking at the problem, and then hand over to Bensari to talk about the data collection in action by MHD in India. Then I'll come back to talk about the findings and mostly to introduce you to the dashboard we've created that shows the results of the project, and finally a little bit of Q&A. So this project was based on Bensari and I meeting at a Royal Academy of Engineering symposium, and this symposium brought together over 60 leaders from different disciplines and countries. We all came together to discuss the challenges that were faced when talking about a resilient future in an urban context. And this was way back in summer of 2019, which feels like a lifetime ago, but some of the themes that were commonly discussed were that cities are tightly coupled systems with interconnected sectors. So we've got things like healthcare, transport, education, and the economy that are all interrelated. Alongside that, climate hazards are increasing. And the current focus is a very formal physical approach to understanding climate impacts. So the sort of problems that we thought were inherent in that are that climate impacts data collection excludes slum areas. It can be quite top-down. Administrative data collection doesn't always go into slums. Climate impacts assessments are not necessarily holistic or based on systems thinking. And in terms of systems thinking, it's not just about these big, complicated physical networks as we often think about it in the engineering world, which is sort of my background in civil engineering. It's also about these complex dynamics that are between the physical environment and the tasks that they're designed for, and the outcomes that are achieved by those tasks. So the third issue was that climate impacts information is inaccessible or irrelevant at times. People have a really hard time connecting with climate change and climate impacts if it's only talked about on a really broad scale and it's never really brought to a local personal level. In addition to that, a lot of times scientific findings about climate change can be very technical. I'm going to do my best to not be too technical in this presentation as well. So the partners that came together during this symposium to create a research proposal were Mahila Housing Trust, who you will probably all know by registering for this webinar that they are leaders in community action and social capital, gender issues, as well as King's College London, who have expertise in qualitative GIS mapping, natural hazard modeling, thinking about disaster risk in new ways. And then there was us at Heriot-Watt University. We have all been working on looking at how climate change is going to impact future floods and droughts in the UK. And it's sort of my job to develop a model, or way of looking at how that's going to impact people in cities through a systems model. So we were awarded some funding for this small research project that was going to last about a year, which was extended partially due to the pandemic as well. And the aims were to tackle those problems that I spoke about on a previous slide. So to include slum areas in our data collection, we were aiming for 5 Jaipur slums. To also take a holistic approach that incorporated systems thinking. We could do that through the model developed at Heriot-Watt. And also to make sure that climate impacts information coming out of that model was as accessible and relevant as possible. Now, originally we had planned to do an in-person consultation event, and that was planned into the proposal for us all to come together in India at the end of the project, run a workshop, get everyone in the same room, and sort of discuss the model results and what they meant to participants, people who had collected data from community action groups on the ground, and how to improve that going forward. What we've done instead is that because of the pandemic and travel restrictions, we have actually created a user-friendly online dashboard to disseminate results that is accessible by mobile phone. It may not be as participatory as we would have wanted it to be, but it's just to say that there's plenty of further research, if anyone knows of any funding opportunities that could be had in the future, in order to take this even further. So what I'm going to do now is try and take you as quickly as possible through our Urban Systems Abstraction Hierarchy. So I'm going to try to take as less of a technical view as possible when explaining this. But if you have very specific questions or anything, just please shoot them my way at the end of the webinar, or afterward. I'll provide my contact email and lots of links to find more information. So this is the Urban Systems Abstraction Hierarchy. It is basically a systems map, and it consists of 5 levels. At the bottom, you have the physical objects. So these are things like religious buildings, schools, hospitals, parks, oceans, things that are in the technical environment as well as the natural environment. The next level up is about what those things do. So what processes do they actually fulfill? So for example, religious buildings would provide a place of worship. They might also do something like act as a community meeting space. You can see that there would be multiple processes. The next level up includes the generalized functions. So this is about how a bunch of processes combine in order to achieve a more broad task. You can see how things are becoming more and more abstract and aggregated as you move up the network. The next level up is about the outcomes for what we should be doing to create a resilient city. So these are the criteria by which we can tell if a city is fulfilling its purposes and actually being resilient. The final level at the very top are the functional purposes, and those include the reasons why the city exists. And these are really fundamental things like cultural identity or economic opportunity. They tend to be the same in every city. The main thing to keep in mind about this is that this is not a spatial infrastructure network. It's not about how different roads are connected to other roads. It's about how things are connected through their functionality. So you're connecting the physical stuff at the bottom to the intangible stuff at the top. And if you want to take away all the fancy academic terminology, you could just say at the bottom level there are things, those things do processes, those processes combine into tasks, those tasks achieve outcomes, specifically about how to achieve resilience, and those outcomes contribute to the fundamental purposes why cities exist and why we live in cities. And the main contribution of looking at a system in this way is that the physical things at the bottom are connected to the intangible things higher up. So we really want to show how the tangible parts of cities are connected to their purposes, rather than just looking at things in a very siloed civil engineering way, where it's all about the physical infrastructure. When you are connecting things in that abstraction hierarchy, you can take any node in the network and ask why it exists, going upward. And going downward, you can also ask how it's achieved. So for example, if you take the node if you take the node religious buildings, you can ask why that exists. Well, that exists to provide a place of worship, which exists to observe religion, which exists to contribute to collective identity and community support. But it also exists to act as a community meeting space, which exists to contribute to community activities and engagement, and then up to these other levels. This is just a small excerpt to illustrate how the links are constructed in this network. You can also take act as community meeting space, a process, and ask how else it could be achieved. So you don't necessarily have to have community meeting spaces all be religious buildings. You could also achieve that through music or theater venues or cafes or schools, universities, parks. This is actually quite an important node that we all know that it's important intuitively because of the pandemic and restricted access to these community meeting spaces, really. But this network really shows it. And likewise, provide place of worship could also be achieved by something like airports. Most airports, major airports, have a space for a prayer room or some sort of quiet area. So although you might not think of an airport as contributing to the observance of religion, it does in some small way have a role. These next two slides are focusing on the content of the abstraction hierarchy. And again, there won't be a test. This is just to give some examples of what are actually in these outcomes and tasks levels of the abstraction hierarchy, because these are really what we're interested in this project. So at the outcomes level, these are all based on the 100 Resilient Cities project. These are all outcomes that were determined through a long series of literature reviews and indicator and data reviews. They include things like minimal human vulnerability, which is basically about having people's basic needs met, whether they've got food, clothing, shelter, or things like effective safeguards to human health and life. So that would include anything that contributes to public health, including formal healthcare systems, but potentially also green spaces for mental health and so on. We've also added two, which we feel were implicit in the other outcomes, but we've drawn them to the forefront. So those additional two were environmental sustainability and socioeconomic equality and equity. Again, there won't be a test. These are all of the 37 tasks that are in the abstraction hierarchy. And again, it's just to give you an example. If you want to look at what all of the detail of the abstraction hierarchy, you can go to this link below and play around with our abstraction hierarchy explorer. But some of these tasks include things like providing emergency services, critical infrastructure like energy supply, or what some people think of as softer tasks like historical and cultural value contributions or recreational activities. So there's a broad range of things, not just looking at one sector at a time. And as you can imagine, this is a massive network. So there are, in the generic template, 481 nodes and almost 4,500 links in this overall network. So we need a way to be able to pull out the most interdependent parts of the network. That means not necessarily that we want to find the most important parts of the network, but that we want to find the things that if they were affected or removed, that would cause the biggest knock-on effects to the rest of the system. So if certain aspects are affected by, for example, climate-related hazards, what are the other sectors or outcomes or tasks that are going to be affected? And using network analysis to do this helps us to track change. So if you, for example, in a flood, know that 6 out of 10 religious buildings are going to be affected, you can wake in all of the links related to religious buildings. That change would propagate up into higher levels of the network, and you'd be able to track which things have been most affected again. So through the urban systems abstraction hierarchy, we have an idea of what makes up a city, both including the tangible and the intangible parts. We've also got a quantifiable way to track the change, and that means that we can look at lots of different scenarios. So in this study, we've been focusing on climate-related hazards, different hazards like water scarcity, heat stress, and flooding. But you could also look at different locations. You could look at hypothetical scenarios that might occur in the future if you had some idea of how much, like, for example, a flood would worsen in 2080. You could also play around with different interventions. So these are all areas that can be explored. I should also say that this template that we've created with the Urban Systems Abstraction Hierarchy is a generic version, and it can be adapted for different locations. We do this by looking at OpenStreetMap data, determining which objects are included or excluded within a city boundary, for example, the Jaipur city boundary, and then removing the types of physical objects that aren't relevant for that context. So for example, Jaipur is not next to an ocean, so you wouldn't have the node seas and tidal range. That would get removed, and any processes that are no longer fulfilled or supported, those would also get removed. So you're filtering different things out based on the context. We've got a bunch of open source software tools that we've developed through the Water Resilient Cities project in order to do this, and I've linked some of them here. I'll put them at the end of the presentation as well. So that's to get to a Jaipur specific urban systems abstraction hierarchy. And then what we wanted to do was engage with community action groups, collect data about specific slums within Jaipur, and then introduce their experience of different hazards into the abstraction hierarchy. So we've got baseline, and then we've got different hazard conditions that we can compare. And I think I will hand over to, this is just an example to show that the Jaipur everyday conditions abstraction hierarchy is slightly different to the generic template. And I will pass on to Ben Sari to explain a bit about how Mahila Housing Trust managed to collect data from 650-ish households during the pandemic in order to pull this off.
Thank you, Melissa, for the brief introduction to the model. Hello, everyone. I am Bansri Sharma, and I will briefly introduce you to Mahila Housing Seva Trust and our approach towards intervention in slums, and how did we collect data for the specific project which we are discussing right now. I hope my screen is visible. Hello?
You're visible, Ben, sorry, thank you.
Thank you very much. Mahila Housing Seva Trust is working since 1994. The approach and mission of the organization is to form social capital in urban slums. I'm sorry, but my slide, okay, I'm able to see now. Thank you. The MHT's approach is to organize and empower women working in informal economy. So primarily we deal with women from urban slums and help them provide technical services and capacity building, which would in turn help them secure better habitat, environment, and basic services. To achieve this mission, we follow a three-step process. Firstly, we establish credibility, that is in form of community-based organizations and community action groups, which we will be discussing in further over the next slides. And formation of this CBOs and CAG together collectively helps in a collective action at slum level. Secondly, we try and direct public funds and also sometimes private funds. And this helps in facilitating democratic and decentralization along with ensuring effective and service delivery at slum level. Thirdly, we try to expand our footprints in various sectors at slum level that includes habitat, water, sanitation, energy, and climate resilience. So working since last 25 years, MHT has presence across 9 Indian states and also have implementing partner across Nepal and Bangladesh. Briefly taking you across the developing social capital model of MHT. MHT, the central to MHT's work is mobilizing and organizing the communities, especially women, as I mentioned earlier. We develop their social capital and empower them to address social, physical, and environmental issues they face, such that they can take charge of their own processes and contribute at city level decision making. For this, we facilitate firstly formation of community-based organization. While intervention in slum, we carry out household listing, and approximately 200 to 250 households together comprise of a community-based organization, and every women-headed household of slum becomes a member of CBO. Further, the women members from CBO together collectively elect 12 to 15 emerging efficient women from the community who can work and be a part of community action group at slum level. And finally, the community action groups across various slums coalesce into an umbrella called Vikasini. Vikasini in Hindi, in English it means a career of development. So it's a feminine connotation which we use. And this federation, when women show exemplar abilities to work at slum level, we assign them Vikasinis, and they further start working across various slums at city level and also help in liaising with a local government to better implement the activities. I am not able to change the slides. Is my third, I give me a minute, I'll just reshare the slides. Is it visible now?
Yes, yeah, we can see it. Perfect.
Thank you. Sorry for the technical glitch. Coming quickly to the project field implementation, which we carried out for the climate resilient slums. As you can see in the Google map, this is the central Jaipur city area, and the highlighted box shows the location of slums. The 5 slums are located here, which is comparatively peripheral to the city. For intervention virtually, considering the COVID situation and the safety protocols which we had to follow, MHT staff could not go to slums in presence, and hence we used the pre-formed community action group from the surrounding adjoining slums, which were located in the surrounding vicinity of the proposed slums for the project. And these CAGs triggered access to the newer communities because they helped to procure a new context of the slum residents, which was comparatively new, and MHT did not have any intervention in the slums. And all these was carried out virtually. So the CAG, which was pre-formed, and the surrounding slums used their social networks to secure the mobile contact numbers of the women members from the newer slums, and we used their virtual contact to carry out the activities. So firstly, community level awareness was carried out, that was virtually through sensitization meetings and video screenings. And these sensitization and video screenings were aimed at introducing MHT and the project, and the possible data collection which would be happening in slums, and also to sensitize the residents on measures to combat heat stress, water scarcity, and flooding. So we did introduce a household level acceptable and implementable measures through which they can address these stresses. The questionnaires were administered across the 5 slums, the names of which have been listed in the slides. And 658 responses were recorded all through the telephonic interviews. And the questions primarily aimed at capturing the experience of water scarcity, heat stress, and floods from the residents. The challenges which we faced and seeing the experience comparatively while we intervene in physical to the slums, that due to emerging situation of COVID and the stricter lockdown which was implemented in 2020 by Indian government, lot of slum dwellers' livelihood was impacted, and hence they chose to migrate, and many of the houses were permanently locked, hence we could not capture the complete residents who were staying over there. Secondly, since the awareness activities and also the data collection, everything was carried out in virtual, we could not have any physical presence with them, and there was no mutual community interaction at slum level, which MHT could facilitate, because if there is a physical interaction, we anticipated that there might be a shift of interest from personal development to collective and slum level development. So we could not address this at 100%. And over the coming next few months, we aim to disseminate the data results to the 5 slum communities. And with this data results, we would try to liaise with local government and help slum residents identify the short-term, medium-term measures which they can implement, and they can try and combat the heat stress, flooding, and water scarcity at slum level. So, thank you. This was the project level data collection and field implementation which we carried out.
Thanks, Bansari. I still think it's amazing that you were able to lead 650 questionnaires being done in COVID times. If you guys have any questions, you can answer them, or you can include them in the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we'll get to them just at the end of the presentation. But for now, I will go back to talk about findings just a little bit. There we go. So MHT were able to go out and connect with people in the slums, even through sort of tangential social networks and through virtual means, by telephone surveys, and administered this questionnaire relating to some demographic aspects and sort of general profile aspects. So the slum area, the age of respondents, the number of people in the household, also a lot of questions having to do with the employment, the formality of work, the location of work. These were all quite important for figuring out where the slum communities would fit into the urban systems abstraction hierarchy. There were also some questions asked about infrastructure, water supply sources, as well as coping strategies for dealing in particular with water scarcity, because at the beginning of the project, this was discussed as our sort of target hazard. We ended up having time to cover not just water scarcity, but also water quality, heat stress, and flooding in different ways to different degrees. We also asked questions about water quality. And then not only the experience of hazards, so did you or did you not experience heat stress, for example, in the last 12 months, or did someone in your household experience in the last 12 months, but also the severity. So for most hazards, we were able to gather information about how many days people experienced flooding or heat stress or water scarcity in general, but also how many days of school were missed, how many days of work were lost in the last year, to sort of put it all into perspective, how different households have been affected in different areas. And then finally, we asked some other questions about hazard impact. So the type of water use that was impacted, usually from water scarcity. Was this domestic water or drinking water, for example? Also, health impacts, usually due to water scarcity or heat stress, or property damage, usually due to flooding. So there's a lot of information there, and all of the findings are available in the dashboard, which I will go into in a minute, but I'm just going to highlight on a couple of slides first what's really most relevant for understanding us in terms of the abstraction hierarchy. So the reason why I'm starting with employment is to figure out exactly where this fits into the abstraction hierarchy. What we found was that different areas were experiencing different types of impacts, even if the hazard was somewhat comparable. For example, if they experienced the same level of flooding. And that was because with different communities with different livelihoods, even though these slum areas are quite close together in proximity, they were made up in different ways. So this is an overall figure to show the breakdown of different job types, but there's obviously varied by location as well. So the most common job types were drivers, including rickshaws, also embroiderers or handicraft workers, or daily wage earners. There's also this undisclosed category that you'll see in some of these plots, and that basically means we didn't want to be disclosive in reporting our results. So for example, one person has said that they have a very niche job, and if we report that one person, it would be easy to identify who it was if you were another person in that slum community. So we wanted to make these anonymous and non-disclosive effectively. So that undisclosed category is usually just the other bucket that we've put here in these plots. You can see how when you look at the formality of work, it varies by job type, even when you look at all of the slums together. So the jobs at the highest risk of informal employment were things like precious stone work, almost 75% of workers, daily wage earners, 73% of workers, and grocery store workers, almost 60% of them didn't have a formal employment. The lowest percentage, or the sort of more secure jobs, were things like drivers, including rickshaws, embroiderers or handicraft workers, and then construction laborers are somewhere in the middle. And you can also break that down by area. So this is just starting to draw out that even though these are quite small areas, there are quite a lot of people with diverse communities in terms of their employment and what they're contributing to the overall urban environment. For example, New Indra Vihar and Pir Dalit Shah had the highest proportion of informal employment at almost 60%, but that's well over 2 times more than Golden Colony at just under 25%. So these things did vary. It is important to collect data at this granular level, possibly in general, but in particular for slums. I'm now going to turn a little bit to the broad findings about hazards, and then the specifics about severity of days of missed school or employment and things like that. I will let you get into on the dashboard yourself if you want to have a play around. But in general, what we found was that when you just asked people if their household experienced different hazards, a yes or no question, only 34% of people or households experienced water scarcity, 59% experienced heat stress, and almost everyone experienced flooding. Now, the survey was taken, I think, a few weeks after a severe flood, which maybe speaks to that's being fresh in everyone's mind as recently experiencing flooding, but nonetheless, it was quite widespread across these areas. And flooding is a more spatial, in engineering terms, hazard than perhaps water scarcity or heat stress. So this just shows that water scarcity in this case was the lowest threat hazard. Heat stress was somewhere in the middle, flooding was the highest. If you look at it, look at the data in this way. And they all vary by area unless you're looking at a more spatial hazard like flooding. But when you start looking at the severity of days, if you look at mean days of heat stress in the last year or mean days of water scarcity, there's a factor of 10 difference. So heat stress on average had a mean 3.2 days per household per year, whereas water scarcity had a mean of 32.3 days per household per year. So we had to go a bit deeper into the data to understand why this was happening, because it's such a stark contrast to the last slide, which suggests that water scarcity isn't as much of a problem. But when you break that down, what we find is that the people who are experiencing water scarcity are experiencing it to an extreme degree. So they're, of the people who are experiencing water scarcity, 89% of that group are experiencing it for, more than 2.5 months in the past year. It's a lot. And there are a smaller proportion of people who are, only having 1 or 2 days per year. So for the people who have this problem, it's a very severe problem. And that's just a broad sort of assessment or overview, a broad taste of what you can find when you start looking at our dashboard and going in by location, by different aspects of education versus employment, or looking at the urban system model. So now what I'm going to do is go into the dashboard. I'm just checking for time to make sure I'm on track. And I think I have already got this up. I'll click on it anyway. So this was designed to be accessible by mobile phone, but it should still look roughly the same on a laptop due to the technical expertise of our brilliant Heriot-Watt team who did this in February and March this year. So basically we've got this embedded into the MHT website. If you go to the MHT website, you can go into resources and climate resilient slums, and this dashboard is embedded in. We've got on the left options to break this down by different slum areas and different hazard types. So you can select sort of normal conditions, what are the everyday experiences, but then what's happening when this area is flooded or experiencing heat stress, etc. As I mentioned before, we have tried to avoid putting absolutely all of the data and plots out here because some of it could be disclosive and could identify individuals. So what we've done for plots that you may think are missing from the dashboard is we've described what the rough trend should be, rather than giving specific numbers. And we've included a summary for each of these areas, which you can download. So if you can't find it in one of these tabs, that information is in a written document here. And hopefully that will allow people to, when they have a good internet connection, download something to their phones and then have it accessible offline to take to their local ward councillor or to their community action group meeting to build resilience action plans. However this information can support them, it's available in an easy to read format offline, hopefully. On the home tab here, we've got the general boundary of Jaipur, and you can see the 5 slums are quite close together here. This is just an introduction to explain what the different tabs are. So we've got the profile tab, which gives information about the demographics in the general slum area, and the general experience of hazards. We've got education, which just talks about education impacts from climate-related hazards, because we didn't have time to ask loads of questions about how many children were in the household and what levels of education people were at. It's quite specific to climate-related impacts. Employment is a bit broader, so that shows information about common job types, formality of work, location, and then how those were impacted by hazards. Infrastructure shows information about water provision, electricity connection, the types of things on that slide previously. And the Urban Systems tab shows the results of what happened when we plugged all this information into the abstraction hierarchy for different scenarios. If you're looking for more information or contact info, further reading, if you were really into scientific reading about the networks in the abstraction hierarchy, it's all here in the About tab. But for now, I'll just show some of the Urban Systems results. So this is supposed to break down that really what we're interested in are the functions or the tasks, that stuff in the middle layer, because those are the activities needed for a city to function. So when they're more impacted than normal, they're going to appear, top 3 most impacted are going to appear in this table, and the top 3 most impacted are going to appear further to the right in a plot that will appear here when I actually choose which selection I want. And the outcomes are going to follow the same structure, but the outcomes are more about how to make sure that the current situation is not putting those prerequisites for future resilience at risk. So if those outcomes have been more impacted, it's possibly a longer term impact on fostering future resilience, not necessarily something that's short term. I will pick these. So if we just look at all, so we're just treating all slum areas as a whole, you can see that a plot comes up here, hopefully, and that it will tell you you've selected the outcomes level, and the scenario is what happens when all these areas are flooded, and that's based on actual questionnaire responses of proportions of people or households that were flooded in specific areas. Then you can see here that the top 3 most affected things were minimal vulnerability, reduced exposure, and socioeconomic equality and equity. And they're as simple as descriptions as we can get to define these compared to our academic tendency to make it very technical, to explain what that actually means for resilience. And if you scroll down to these, you can hover over these different points. These are abbreviations for the actual outcome, but if you hover over them, you'll be able to see that there's a node definition, and it tells you which scenario and which area, what the actual numeric result is. Really what we're interested in is not, the severity of the percentage change. This is about prioritizing which things we want to look at first, what's been most impacted, how do we want to start breaking things down for our future resilience planning or infrastructure planning in order to just take a bite out of the elephant, because these are huge problems that are multifaceted. So how do you break and prioritize that down in a manageable way? So at the risk of oversimplifying, we've got a top 3 table up here. If you want to break this down by specific areas, you can again go to Ashraf colony and flooding, and you can see that these percentage changes are kind of the same as when you look at all slums. Some of the top 3 rankings might change. This one has flagged environmental sustainability. But then if you switch to a different hazard, these can, this one's not changing so much, but I think if I go to new intervihar, you can see that flooding has quite low percentage changes, heat stress has quite low, water scarcity has quite low. Move to a different area and they do vary a bit more. And this is really apparent in the tasks level. So here we've got Shanty Colony, one of the larger colonies, has a top 3, learning and education, social interaction, and employment provision were the most affected tasks. And this partially has to do with how much, the severity to which children in that area miss school, how much local businesses like restaurants or cafes or public spaces were affected, community spaces were affected that might have affected social interaction. Schools would also contribute to this as well. And employment provision was affected because there might have been loads of people losing work in that particular area due to water scarcity. If we again look at one of these smaller colonies, I think this is where we see things getting a bit more starkly different between the different hazards. So yeah, in Pir Dalat Shah, you've got clothing provision that's been quite largely affected, and part of that is down to the fact that there's possibly more embroiderers and handicraft workers in that area. But what this is saying is, if you want to protect the clothing provision sector in Jaipur as a whole, you really need to be protecting this area from flooding. So there are lots of ways to approach these problems, but overall, it allows you to prioritize what you want to look at first. And hoping that gives a quick introduction to the dashboard and how it should be used. And I think I will return to my slides here. There we go. So to just broadly wrap up, the problem was that we had an potentially exclusive, piecemeal and inaccessible way of going about climate impacts and modeling them. We have this new way of looking at the problem through the Urban Systems Abstraction Hierarchy. Mahila Housing Trust has this really fantastic, participatory, empowering approach, and did all this data collection with that in mind. And part of the solution is going to be going about it in this way in the future, empowering women to collect data and lead decision making. So we need to be taking these systems approaches, but we also need to be making the findings as accessible as possible and handing community action leaders the reins from there. I've included a link to the dashboard down here again, and I will include it on the last slide as well. But I think we may be ready to open it up for questions. If you have any technical questions about the abstraction hierarchy after this, I'll just leave this slide up so that you can take these links away, take down my email, and happy to have a chat about this at any time. So I will just have a look at the Q&A here, and maybe we can tackle these together, Benzari. Thanks so much for your time, first of all, everyone. Okay, the first question is, do you want to go for it, Benzari?
Yes, I'll take up the first question.
Okay.
It says that how MHT can take help from AHUS model and research findings while working with slum communities. So I think AHUS model, as you did know, that it brings out the nodes and networks at slum level and how tangible and intangible things are connected and affected. So the key takeaway which we can use from this model would be pre-disaster assessing that if a particular hazard or if a particular stress overpowers or intervenes into the slum, how the community will be affected and what could be the possible measures which we can take to avoid it, or how city governments can be better prepared for the hazard. And if the hazard has already hit, like in case of Jaipur, where a flooding was experienced, because on last year on 14th of August, if I remember clearly, there was a rain, unexpected heavy rains for a day, and the city system was not equipped to take it, and hence the slum residents did mention that they experienced flooding and water stagnation for 2 or 3 days, and there was a lot of financial losses which were reported citywide. So when such kind of hazard hit the city, the model helps us understand that what were the nodes and networks of functions or things which were impacted at slum level, and how can we better prepared and equipped for the next possible, hopefully not, but if flood hits again. So yes, I think pre, post, and maybe during the disaster, because like we did conduct a virtual data collection process. So without going to the particular slum site, we were able to collect the data and also understand the impacts of various stresses on the slum communities. So this is a very key and very quantifiable, I would say, results which AHUS will bring out, and right now, during next couple of months, we do aim to make the slum residents more aware about how the stresses have impacted, and they using the data to better improve their living environment and habitat. Yeah. I hope this answers the question.
Thanks, Bansari. So the next question is, we've taken 5 slums from Jaipur, but how many households have we covered in that data collection?
Yes, so they were 658 households, so approximately 70% from the total households of the 5 slums.
Yeah, I think initially it was around, we're targeting about that amount, and we still managed to do it in the pandemic times. Am I correct in thinking that normally MHT do a sort of 2-stage project, or have in the past, where you do a rapid assessment of like 10% of the people in the slum and then try to cover as many as possible in the second round? Did I get that backwards?
No, it's a backward. So normally when we intervene, we do a household listing. So that is 100% of the households from slums. And we understand the basic infrastructure, yes or no they have. And the quick profile of the slum. So that covers all the households from the slum. And the next step is baseline data collection, where we typically do 10 to 15% of the households of the slum, but it depends on the project and the research requirement. So here we were aiming at 100%, but yes, the situations changed, and also, like I mentioned, there were many residents who moved out from the city, and we did found many households locked. So we could achieve target of 70%.
Yeah, like 100% is always a lofty goal, but I'm glad we shot for it anyway. 70% is not bad at all. So the next question, I think, is for me. So how can other organizations wanting to use this model access it? Right, for location-specific organization, is it open or restricted to development of this model? The answer to that is that if you go to these links that I've put up on this presentation, you can contact me by email, and I can walk you through it if you like, how to put all these different parts together, but all of this should be open source. So if this was going to be applied in an entirely new context, what I would say is you would need to start in parallel with 2 parts. So one aspect is making sure that your abstraction hierarchy is location specific. For example, if you were going to apply this to a city in Nigeria, or another city in India, or somewhere in the UK, it can be anywhere internationally, you would want to review what's in the abstraction hierarchy. If it's international, make sure that the way that you've done the linking is roughly consistent. So for example, there are some government aspects that aren't going to be the same. Council offices in Scotland are not going to be the same as government functions in India all the time. So you have to do a review of that on a sort of conceptual level. Then use the open source software that we've created that's available for anyone to download on GitHub. And you can use the open source software R in order to actually apply all of this stuff. It's all completely free. In order to extract OpenStreetMaps data in your location, figure out what objects aren't in your location, remove them from your abstraction hierarchy for your specific city that you're looking at. Then you've got a model of sort of everyday conditions. So in parallel to that, you'd want to be collecting data or have access to some sort of data that reflects whatever hazard you're trying to model. So in the UK, what we've been doing is using flood extents from the Environment Agency, for example, because it's easy to use in these tools that we already have set up to say, we've got all this OpenStreetMap for example, Manchester. And then we've also got a shapefile for where is going to be flooded, so we can just cookie cutter out all the objects that would be flooded, figure out what percentage of churches, religious buildings, schools, these kinds of things would be flooded, and that can be done in these open source software tools as well. So you just need some way of making your abstraction hierarchy location specific, and then some way of getting your scenario or your hazard data. And it doesn't always have to be that you go out and collect door-to-door data. Sometimes that's available depending on what you're interested in. And then you could put them together using only these free tools. It probably would just take a few tutorials, as this is very exploratory research. It would probably take a little bit of being in touch with myself and the Water Resilient Cities team to make sure you're comfortable with it going forward, I would say. But all of this stuff is free and open source. So the next question is for Bensari.
Yes, I'll take this up, which is from Nicholas, and yes, that, yeah. I mentioned about challenges, and there was no mutual understanding with the respondents due to use of virtual platform. How do you plan to overcome this and achieve mutual understanding for effective intervention? Okay, so firstly, I think I would like to correct you. It was not a mutual understanding, but a mutual interaction, which we typically observe and anticipate that when a group of women members get collected for a particular purpose, they tend to interact amongst themselves. And that was the interaction which we could not facilitate. And secondly, how do we plan to overcome this? So the project intervention did not aim at creation of community action groups, because it was a research project and had a different anticipated output at the end of it. But typically when we intervene in slums and we do a habitat improvement intervention, MHT starts with formation of community action groups, and it includes formal training of 12 to 18 months, which is spread across a time of across various topics. And these slum residents are trained on the topics like how to liaise with government, or what are the basic services, and the city structure. So when we already have women leaders at slum level working actively for these topics, these possible thing can be avoided or mitigated, because that is how we did also get access in the newer slum communities. So yes, from my experience, I would say that formation of social capital at slum level would help overcome this, possibly for the other projects, which are not completely with a focus of research. And the last part is the virtual platforms that we use to administer, considering the income and literacy level. Yes. From our understanding, which we had from the community action groups of the surrounding slums, and MHT's experience of working in that particular area since past 7 to 8 years, there is at least a presence or existence of one Android phone at slum level, if not particularly owned by women, but yeah, there was a phone with internet connection available. So we did use the very convenient platforms which are popular here in India, that is Zoom and WhatsApp. So creating groups on WhatsApp and conducting meetings on Zoom was relatively comfortable, and women were also used to it because it's a simpler process. And yes, yeah, hope this answers it. And again, the question says that how did COVID-19 pandemic affect the project? Yeah, I think we have mentioned a lot of times that the project was originally planned for in-person intervention, and it was supposed to get wrapped up in October 2019. But yes, due to COVID, we could not start our interventions. And when we were about to commence the project, there were stricter guidelines and regulations from the funder to not carry out any in-person or field activities, and hence the delay and hence the virtual activities. And yes.
Yeah, I think nobody knew what it was going to be like doing research during the pandemic, especially international multi-partner research, where there's so many different rules and regulations and you want to follow ethical guidelines and things like that. So it was definitely a learning experience, I think, for everybody. I think that's probably true for every research project during this period. The next question is about some of the actual findings, I think. So Shanty Colony and Golden Colony having the problem of heat stress more than water scarcity. How come big differences there compared to other three slums? So I think the question is, why is there a difference for Shanty Colony and Golden Colony compared to the other 3 slums? And that's a sort of complicated question to answer. It seems like there should be a straightforward answer. And I don't know if, Bensari, if you have anything to add to this, please do at the end. But from looking at the data in depth myself and going through, for example, some of the plots that weren't presented about water coping strategies and measures people were taking to cope with water scarcity. Certain areas had a much higher uptake of strategies and had a broader range of strategies for coping with water scarcity. And it seemed that their understanding of whether they were experiencing water scarcity was different based on that. In a way that many people were taking up strategies to cope with water scarcity, and a smaller proportion of people said that they actually experienced water scarcity. So there's a little bit of an interaction in those questions where maybe in Shanty Colony and Golden Colony, water scarcity is still quite a big problem, but in general terms, they're maybe coping with it slightly better than some of the smaller colonies. Those are also the 2 bigger colonies where they might have had more interaction with each other and outside slums and wider social networks and everything as well. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but it's definitely hard to unpick why one area is experiencing things in a different way from another, and some of it's down to those coping strategies.
Maybe also I think that this boils down to the fact that the experience and how do slum dwellers feel particular about a particular issue. Because for water scarcity, I mean, since there are peripheral slums, there are no city government networks reaching to those areas. But yeah, they do have private vendors and they have their own sources of how to manage or cope up the water demand at household level. So for every individual and for every household, there's a different set of parameters which they take according to their acceptable income level. And hence, I feel that because of the varied experiences or the collective availability of water in a particular area might be giving a striking difference.
I would say maybe if we were to go into a bigger project off of the end of this small seed funding project, it would be interesting to look at the coping strategies for all 3 types of hazard, not just the water scarcity, because that was really the only space we had. We wanted to keep the questionnaire a little bit, not too long, and ask about every possible intervention people were using. But we did focus on the water scarcity ones. So it'd be interesting to see what the interaction was and the opportunities for further uptake of other interventions for heat stress versus water scarcity. Meaning, what are people just not aware of that they could be doing better, and what are people they've already maxed out all of their opportunities for household level interventions, and this is really time to focus on local community planning or infrastructure planning on a broader scale, because I think those are important questions for practical forward planning. This one's probably for you, Ben, sorry. What are the reasons about slum dwellers' perception about the flood hazard?
Yes, so, okay, I think I did mention priorly that this particular data and the perceptions or the strong validation of experiencing of flood has been particularly because there was unanticipated heavy downpour, and particularly it was not experienced because it started at midnight and a lot of people were left sleeping, and the city capacity was not there to cope up with this. So many residents experienced this, and plus since it's in a peripheral area, the whole area where the slums are located, it does not have a proper sewerage network or where the water could be channelized. So slum residents did report about the financial losses, and yes, so I hope this answers the question, because I'm not completely understanding the perception about flood hazard. They did experience and they were not very ready to take up this, which typically they are well aware of water scarcity and heat stress, because here we have in Jaipur particularly a very harsh and hot climate, and they do have few strategies, or in back of the mind they are well prepared for these things, but this flood hazard was sudden, and in month of August, where we typically do not experience rainfall.
I was really surprised in the findings that it was so widespread. And I mean, you'd mentioned it in passing during a meeting that there had been some flooding, but up till that point, it didn't seem like a priority or something that was commonly experienced. And it just highlights how big of a challenge climate change is going to be, because it's not just about coping with the things that we're used to coping with. We've got to be prepared for this global weirding and the stuff we're not expecting as well.
Yes,
hopefully,
yeah. Because even for our project, we were focusing only on water scarcity and heat stress initially, but we did include a set of questions which would capture their experience of flood. And almost at that point of time, before we started our data collection, a month before or something, this event happened. So
yeah.
So
I don't want to say lucky, but yeah.
A takeaway to be well prepared.
So there's another question here about what was the effect of 98% of populations with floods? What was the effect on their sanitation services and infrastructure? And then how does Mahila intend to make these services and infrastructure flood resilient in the affected communities? This is a good question, because one of the other things in our questionnaire was about the water quality, and there was a specific question about whether flooding had caused water quality to go down or water quality to be affected by sewage, because it's a somewhat common thing if there's floods for the water quality to be compromised in some way. So I was interested in that because there were a bunch of responses that water quality was on average quite bad, and in some areas it was very bad. In one area it was almost good. So again, it varied across the different slum areas. I wonder how much that was affected by the flooding, because I don't think that anyone specifically said they had noticed the infrastructure compromised by the flooding, but the water quality was still reported as not very good in general. I don't know if you've got any insights into how it was like on the ground.
And yeah, the second part of the question, I think how does MHT intend to make these services and infrastructure flood resilient in affected communities? For right now, for limiting ourselves to this particular project and our work planned in over next couple of months, we are trying and aiming to use these results and make aware about these results to slum communities, and also make them understand about the network and nodes and how it's impacting their everyday lives, and which in turn they will use to present these results to city local governments, because when women leaders go with the technical findings, or we generally know what the impact is, but when we have a substantiated and backed up by some model, the city governments might consider this in the larger development plans or interventions at local level for now. But yes, if we have a specific project funding focusing for making communities resilient on floods, we could have planned interventions which MHT can facilitate at slum level. But yes, for now, a couple of actions which have been intended are the which I've mentioned right now. Marisa, maybe you would like to take up the question, what is meant by heat stress?
I was going to ask you, I think you'd probably be more of an expert. I'm in Scotland. We don't do heat stress here. So, I mean, I'm imagining heat stress as, in layman's terms, as being about really high temperatures and lack of ventilation. and these kinds of things, rather than being about lack of water, which would be more water scarcity.
Yes. What we understand and how we also explain, I'm sorry, did I interrupt you? Because
No, go ahead.
Yeah. What we understand, what we also try to explain to slum dwellers when we ask the question is that they are impacted by heat stress when they do report any economic activity or any everyday household routine which is getting impacted due to heat. For example, if someone is selling with vegetables, the informal vending which they carry out. If it's summer months, it will definitely impact the number of hours they'll be able to sell vegetables in open area, and that would have a direct implication on the amount of money which would they be earning for a month. So this is how we explain to slum dwellers that any direct effect which they experience in their earnings or everyday life or any activities which they carry out in routine would be captured as a heat stress or experience of heat stress.
Yeah, I think it's easier to understand for me if someone's explaining how it's actually going to impact me. It's similar to the climate change in general. Someone's just saying, oh, the ice caps are melting. It's a lot harder to connect with than there will be flooding on your doorstep. I think I've already answered how can the model be applied in other locations, but if I haven't, whoever's asked that question, just email me. Are there any city government-led measures included in your project? Was the next question. Not that I'm aware of. This was quite a small project between just the two universities in the UK and MHT at this point.
Yes, not at this point of time, but we aim to do this soon.
Yeah, my hope would be that with more time and funding, we'd be able to use this as a platform for actually going out and doing these sort of consultations, getting the ball rolling, because really, my feeling is that it should be led by the people in the communities to take this information and decide what they want to do about it and how they want to approach those aims, if that makes sense. So I've tried as much as possible to be supportive rather than top down. And then, did the model include solutioning for these stresses from a systems thinking approach, was the next question. So in terms of the way the abstraction hierarchy works, I did mention a bit about interventions earlier, and I think that's what this question is getting at, if I'm understanding it correctly. The model didn't have anything built into it to be able to predictively say, if this situation happens, then this XYZ impact happens in the long term. So if this heat stress situation and these interventions were implemented, then a certain number of people would be impacted to a lesser degree. Wasn't quite so cause and effect. What we're doing with the abstraction hierarchy is really taking a snapshot of a year, a point in time really, of what's happened in the last year, and then stepping back to look at that, reflecting on whether that's really true to people's real lived experience, and then having some discussion about how to manage those experiences, those results of what's been identified as the most impacted things, and then how to manage change going forward. So I would like to say that there's a model that does it all, but I think in reality, it would be more of a process of using the abstraction hierarchy to identify some critical aspects, stepping back, taking a sort of mixed methods approach to discuss all of those plans and options in full, and then maybe revisiting the abstraction hierarchy once you have a set of interventions that are proposed by that community group. So there's room to trial interventions, but it's definitely not something that's going to give you a specific answer that's definitely going to work in every context. It's just there to sort of guide discussion. And I think we're coming to the end of our webinar. I think we're 1 minute over. So thank you very much for all of your wonderful questions and your participation and attendance. We really appreciate it. I think we're all, I feel really good about having done this project. It's been a wonderful experience to work with MHT, and it's been one of my first independent research projects. So this is a real milestone for me. I appreciate all of your participation. And I think if you have any further questions, don't hesitate to get in touch with me at m.bedinger@hw.ac.uk. And please feel free to play around with the dashboard and poke holes in it as well. Do you have any closing remarks, Bensari?
No, I think I would like to thank all the participants and for scooping out the time and coming here to listen to this very interesting topic. Yes. You can address the questions at the mentioned email address. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.